Thanks everyone for coming tonight. This is the second speaker in our 2015 Wilderness Issues Lecture Series. The focus this year, of course, is wildlife, wildlands, wild resources research. And so we're bringing you a series of speakers focused on alternative resources and value to public lands that we might not typically discuss, that being research. Tonight, we're going to be hearing a talk titled Why Protect Wildlands? The Debate Over the Value of Wilderness by author and ecologist George Wuerthner. Some of his publications may have been books that you've read for classes, and some of you may be familiar with some of his works. He actually is an alum of the University of Montana, and a bit of trivia for those of you in the audience that are Wilderness and Civilization Program students or alumni. George was the first, in the first graduating class of the precursor to the Wilderness and Civilization Program, which is the Round River program that some of you may remember from the early 1970s at the University of Montana. So that was really exciting for me to learn. I've met some of the faculty that taught in the program, but never a former student. So some other information about our speaker tonight. George has published over 38 books on a variety of topics from natural history to environmental issues. His most recent books are Keeping the Wild and Protecting the Wild. George got his undergraduate degree here at the University of Montana and went on to do graduate work at Montana State University, the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the University of Oregon. He has previously worked as a ranger in some of the most beautiful places in North America, including Gates of the Arctic National Park. He was a river ranger on several wild and scenic rivers in Alaska, a botanist for the Bureau of Land Management in Idaho, and taught field ecology courses for a number of colleges and universities over the years. He was one of the founding board members for the Wildlands Project, which is now the Wildlands Network, and served on the board of several other conservation organizations, including Restore the Northwoods, which advocates creation of a national park in Maine. He also holds a commercial guiding license for Yellowstone National Park. He's visited hundreds of designated wilderness areas and parks over the years. He's currently the Ecological Projects Director for the Foundation for Deep Ecology. And I have a few students in this room who were actually traveling with me recently in Patagonia, and we went to the proposed Patagonia National Park. And the Foundation for Deep Ecology, of which George is a board member, was instrumental in that project as well. So he's actually been through the Henny Many, and he's been to the Chacabuco Valley, and he's seen Lago Cochrane. So for those of you students, there's some place-based similarities as well. So with that, I would like to go ahead and welcome George to tonight's series and open it up to you.
Well, thank you. So this is a new book, Protecting the Wild, that's just come out. You can, in a week or so it'll be available. And I decided that what I would do is talk about the themes that are in that book as part of my talk tonight. And so I have to start out and say this is the first time I put this PowerPoint together, and it's probably going to be a little rough around the edges. And I just found out from Natalie that maybe even some of it's a little simplistic for this group. But we'll go through those things faster maybe than others. But the purpose of the book is to counter a trend that has come about largely in academia. I don't think a lot of average people know there's a debate going on about the value of wilderness and parks. And yet this debate has been off and on for actually a couple of decades. But it has this name that's nebulous. There's all sorts of names for it. But basically, what we call the Anthropocene boosters. And their basic assumption is that human needs trump intrinsic rights and values in nature. And so they have these various sort of parts to their argument. One, conservation rests on protecting nature at the expense of human welfare. Conservation rests upon a premise of pristine nature. Conservationists assume nature is fragile, and although we've created many protected areas, conservation is failing to protect biodiversity, and conservation is failing socially, losing support outside of an older, elite, wealthy minority. And by the way, those are my kids there when they were younger in the Teton Wilderness. So that's sort of the main arguments, and I'm going to come back to those arguments and sort of try to provide what I think are counters to them. But one of the main advocates of this has been Peter Cavera, who's of the Nature Conservancy, chief scientist. And nature is resilient, not fragile. There's no wilderness unspoiled by humans. Thoreau was a townie. This has to do with a paper they wrote. Conservation by many measures is failing. And so who are the people? There's main advocates are the Breakthrough Institute, Stuart Brand with the Whole Earth Catalog, Peter Cavera I mentioned, Ernie Ellis, a geography professor, and Emma Maris, A Rambunctious Garden. She wrote a book called Rambunctious Garden. And those folks, and many others, but these are some of the people that are articulating these arguments frequently. And there's no agreed upon name for the movement. There's Anthropocene boosters, neo-greens, new environmentalists, new conservationists, postmodern greens. So you'll see all these terms used because there isn't an accepted term for that thinking. But the main idea is that humans now modify so much of the Earth that we are now the equivalent of a geological force. So it used to be, we called it the Holocene as a geological period. Now it's, these boosters are saying it's the Anthropocene. Humans are now like a geological force on the Earth. And one of the papers that sort of pushed this perspective was written by Peter and a couple of his colleagues called Conservation in the Anthropocene Beyond Solitude and Fragility. And it was published online at the Breakthrough Institute. And the main theme of it is that protection of biodiversity for biodiversity's sake is not really an adequate rationale for conservation. Instead, it should be what benefits the widest number of people, especially the poor. So it's clothed within the idea of trying to help people who are largely live in poverty around the world, which I don't think anybody would disagree with isn't a laudable goal. The problem is, if you read a lot of what's being said, it's very similar to what the industrial exploiters used as their rationales for doing exploitation of the Earth, and the results are often the same because in a lot of cases those who are poor don't wind up getting the benefits anyway. And so it provides cover for the industrial exploiters of the world, but hidden under the agenda of helping the poor. At least that's what many of the people who contributed to the book would say. And as part of this is the whole concept of wilderness and parks idea is under attack. Dave Foreman, who some of you may know, used to be the spokesperson for Earth First, and now has written a whole lot of books about conservation and so forth, calls this a conservation divide. And these ideas that are of wilderness and park has always been under attack by those who want to exploit it. But now we have this new group coming from sort of social justice, you might say, on the left, using the same basic arguments. And a lot of this tends to be historians, cultural geographers, and so forth, in those kinds of fields. And again, the Anthropocene has arrived, and we have altered so much of the earth that it's no longer natural. Humans are now in charge, and we have to garden or manage the earth. And it's not only possible, but required that we manage the earth as good stewards of the land. And corollaries to this perspective is that human technology can solve global environmental problems, and there's no limits on human aspiration and population and ingenuity. In other words, we don't have to really worry about endangered species. We can solve global warming. We can take care of continued population growth and all these problems through technological fixes. So there's a real faith in technology being a solution to global problems. And part of that argument is that pristine wilderness is non-existent and gone. And the idea is, you know, if somebody walked across an area, then obviously people have been there. It's no longer pristine. There's very few people that I know that are involved in conservation who think that any place is pristine in the sense that it's never been touched by humans. But there are degrees of differences in how much of the landscape is affected by human manipulation and human activity. So if you go to Los Angeles, and you're in the middle of Los Angeles, that's a very human created landscape that's managed for human pursuits. And you contrast that to the middle of the Bob Marshall Wilderness or the Selway Bitterroot here, and there's quite a bit difference in the degree of human influence on that landscape. And so it's sort of a straw man to make up this whole idea of that nature is pristine, and that's what conservation is about. Because I don't know anybody who's a serious conservationist who thinks that we're protecting lands that have no human influences on them. The other part of this whole thing is nature is resilient and not fragile. And what Kervera and some of the others say is that environmentalists have exaggerated the impact of humans on nature, and nature is capable of bouncing back from our activities. And one of the examples they use is that, you know, we blew up a nuclear bomb on Bikini Atoll, and there's coral reefs growing back there. Or you can go to Mount St. Helens, that poster there, and go and see the forest has come back and so forth. So this is the argument that nature is resilient. But I will get to this, but I can't help but comment about this right now, is that if you look around and see how resilient nature is, we've had a huge effect. 4/5 of the fish species in the western United States, native fish, are on the endangered species list. They're candidates for listing. You know, you can say nature's resilient, but there's a lot of evidence that nature is not doing that well as a result of our manipulation and our effects on the landscape. Species are going extinct at a very rapid rate. But the comeback is, well, that isn't a bad thing because evolution will create new species. I just read an article last week where one of the advocates of this position was saying that, well, we've had major extinctions in the past, which are true, for various natural phenomenon reasons. And every time you get a lot of new species created as a result, like the dinosaurs went extinct and we suddenly had this flourishing of mammals, for example. But the thing is that takes place over millions of years. It doesn't happen overnight. And so we do get new species, but it's still, from an ethical point of view, I would argue not correct to just assume it's okay to allow species to go extinct if we can do something about it. And the analogy, I don't know if it's a good analogy, but I'll use it anyway. It's sort of like saying all of us in this room here, except for you really young students, we're all kind of old and taking up space, so it'd be on the earth, it'd be okay to shoot us and get rid of us now so that there's more space for young people. But we wouldn't think that that was okay. You know, it's sort of like that's the same idea as letting species go extinct, in my view. So conservation must serve human needs. So what we have to do is find ways to have economic development and not harm animals. So you have this picture here, the caribou and the North Slope in Alaska near Prudhoe Bay with the oil fields there, as if that hasn't had an impact. And if you know anything about the studies about caribou and the oil fields there, this is not really a common occurrence to have the caribou right there next to the oil fields. And maintaining ecosystem services for humans, the primary goal would be protecting, and if we have conservation, what we're doing is we're justifying it in how it, for example, we may protect the forest because it will make clean drinking water for the community downstream. And the problem with that is not every species or place has a human, we can identify a human need that's being served by that. So does that mean you let the species that we don't, and there's thousands, hundreds, millions of species that we don't know anything about, it's okay for them to be go extinct just because we can't identify a human purpose that's served by it. And the final thing, particularly with the Nature Conservancy now, is that corporations are good. We should stop criticizing corporations and start working with them to save the world. We don't need less logging, we need better logging. We don't need less oil and gas drilling. We need better drilling and so forth. And this is the Deepwater Horizon, if you don't recognize it, sinking into the Gulf of Mexico. It looks like a battleship, doesn't it? It's a very cool picture. Anyway. And promote the working landscape, not parks or wilderness. We should focus on better management of working lands, the farms, timberlands, rangelands, and so forth. And by the way, if you don't know where that came from, this whole idea of working landscapes, it was a marvelous propaganda ploy. It started in Maine, in the industrial forest there, where there was a lot of criticism of clear cutting, and the timber industry had to come up with some way to make clear cutting seem like it was okay. So they came up with this idea of the working landscape. And because, you know, in America, we have this whole puritanical thing about work and stuff. And so, you want the landscape to be doing something good for people. And instead of having that, unemployed, lazy wilderness out there that doesn't do anything. We have working landscapes, we have working rangelands and so forth. And that term, unfortunately, has been adopted by a lot of people even in the conservation movement, which I think, indirectly has a effect on how we think about those lands. And strictly protected areas like parks and wilderness, that's passé. There was an article in the LA Times earlier this year where there was a conference saying about how national parks are no longer useful things to have, that we need to have, and if we have anything, it should be right on the edge of cities, which is, I don't think anybody would disagree. It's not a bad thing to have parks and places for people to go, nature close to cities. But that doesn't mean we don't need places like Yosemite anymore. And part of this paper that I mentioned earlier, and some other things that have been written, go beyond deconstructing the conservation ideal. They also sort of imply that people that are well known in the environmental movement as icons like Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, Rachel Carson, Ed Abbey, and so forth, are hypocrites and so forth. Like, for example, Creve talks about how Ed Abbey, who at least some of you are probably familiar with, wrote a book called Desert Solitaire. And why he was writing that book, he was writing letters back to his wife in New York saying he missed her. So therefore that showed that he really wasn't interested in wilderness, and that he was a hypocrite because he missed his wife. I don't know about you guys, but I've spent a lot of time in wilderness. I still miss my girlfriends and wives over the years, and it doesn't mean I don't like wilderness. But that's how it's portrayed. Okay, and finally, in the most extreme, conservation is a tool of oppression. We're creating parks and protected areas at the expense of people, and that should be the primary purpose, is protecting lands for people. And so, as a way to sort of deconstruct this whole idea of parks and wilderness, they use this term that wilderness doesn't exist, places untrammeled by man never existed. And a recent paper by Ernie Ellis, published a paper called Used Planet, A Global History, where he attempts to suggest that human impacts were more widespread, that's what should be widespread, not space, and earlier than most studies suggest. And part of this is to sort of take away in a sense, to devalue the idea that there is any place that's wild. And I think most of these things are written by people that really haven't spent much time outdoors. That's my opinion, because if you've spent any time in the Bob Marshall Wilderness or the Selway Bitterroot or up in the Arctic or whatever, you know that these places are not totally dominated by humans, and this is they're not, they've never been cultivated. They're roadless lands like this. This is a picture of the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness just south of Missoula here. That is still largely an area that is self-willed and mostly the influences on it are from natural processes. And one of the arguments that is used by people like Ernie Ellis and some of the others is about fire and how Native Americans used to set fire to the landscape, and therefore that was an example of how the whole landscape was managed and manipulated. However, one of my other areas of interest is fire ecology, and I will tell you that there's a whole lot of landscapes that don't burn very well, and were never influenced that much by Native American burning. A lot of the lower elevations, perhaps, but a lot of the higher elevations, too wet, too most of the time to be burned, and what burning occurred would be considered compensatory rather than additive to that. And there have been a number of studies that have looked at, for example, how much of a landscape has been, it can be demonstrated that there was an additive effect of fire, and it's usually right around villages and so forth, but across the whole landscape, the influence is much lower. Same with hunting. You think about the days of before the horse particularly, and you're out there, you shoot an elk, how far are you going to drag that elk back to your village? You may kill a lot of the elk in the immediate area around where you're living, but further out, you're not going to have as much effect. Just like if you look at humans today, how we use this landscape. Missoula Valley has a lot of people in it, but there's a whole lot of Montana that doesn't have a lot of people in it. So even today, we are geographically aligned on the landscape with differing and varying degrees of influence. And it was the same with the Native Americans. Well, anyway, this whole concept has infiltrated around the world. At the recent World Parks Conference in Australia, the Park Service for Venezuela, which had one of the best and first national park systems in Latin America, had a letter to the other park people at this conference saying that the park system in Venezuela is getting totally torn apart and dismantled. And it's being done in the name of providing opportunities for the poor. But of course, like a lot of these things, the rich are the ones, and the people that have power are the ones that get a lot of these resources. And again, it's done in the name of helping the poor. And so this is a letter that they circulated. They said it is the government that's using a humanistic and ecological rhetoric while favoring all kinds of forbidden activities, for example, allowing oil wells to be drilled in national parks, eliminating national parks, substituting the professional park staff for party political things. Same thing has happened in Brazil and Peru and so forth. In 1984, 92% of Brazil's parks were strictly protected areas, like we think of someplace like Yellowstone. Since that time, it's become fashionable to have sustainable use reserves, and by 2009, the percentage of strictly protected areas had dropped to 38% of the protected areas. And and when you look at whether these sustainable use areas work as good as parks at protecting biodiversity and natural features and so forth, what you find is that they don't work as well. That there's a problem in all parks in places like the Amazon where there's trespass, poaching, there's, because they don't have the same park capacity infrastructure to protect areas like we do in the U.S. They have more things like illegal logging and so forth. But all those things happen less in strictly protected areas than in the sustainable use reserves and so forth. So if your measurement is how well do these different approaches protect biodiversity and wildlands, the strictly protected areas of what we call parks or wilderness work more effectively. And then what's happened is not only are they favoring the sustainable use reserves over creation of new parks, but they've actually eliminated parks in places and opened them up to more development. So this led to an elimination of more than 1 million hectares of protected parks in one Brazilian state and a reduction in the size of several other parks. So this whole way of thinking about things is really a threat to the long-term goal of protecting biodiversity. And so this will give you my age. There's a song by The Who, which was called "We Won't Be Fooled Again." And it says, "I'll tip my hat to the new Constitution, take a bow for the new revolution, smile and grin at the change all around, pick up my guitar and play just like yesterday. Then I'll get on my knees and pray that we don't get fooled again, don't get fooled again." You meet the new boss, same as the old boss. The idea being that the old boss was, we're going to develop the lands for, you know, a timber company or something like that, an oil company. Now we're going to develop the land supposedly for the poor, but it's the same old boss. It's still developing the land primarily for industrial purposes. So there have been some studies that have looked at how well do these things work. World Watts Institute did a reserve of reserves, and they found extractive reserves are not limited to extractive activities such as nut harvesting. Like a lot of times they'll make these sustainable reserves and they'll say, we'll allow people to go in there and harvest nuts, or we'll allow them to collect rubber, like in Brazil. But what happens is a lot of times a lot of these areas then get opened up to other, you know, new roads, new people move in there. They have bring in cattle. They cut down the forest for cattle and so forth. And these reserves are considered a way to protect biodiversity and at the same time spurring local economic growth and development. But the research shows that this may be premature. The research says that it isn't working, but they're giving the benefit of the doubt. Some of the others that are attacking the idea of parks and wilderness say that parks don't work, but that where you find that these things don't work, it's usually because they're too small or lack good enforcement or management. It doesn't mean that the idea of parks and wilderness is a bad idea. And you can go to places like, I spent a lot of time in Alaska. You go to the parks up in Alaska, and you find that all the species that were originally there are in these parks are still there because they're big parks. They take up a lot of the landscape. When you have a problem with a loss of species, it's often because the parks are totally surrounded by too much other development. And so that doesn't say that there's something wrong with the idea of parks. That means that, in my view, that we have to have bigger parks and bigger wilderness areas and connections between them so that they function well. And park conservation strategies are not failures. If you look around, even here in the lower 48 states, where do you find things like grizzly bears and other species that are in trouble? They tend to be focused in the places that are found in the places that are protected, whether it's wilderness or parklands or other places where we don't have multiple use occurring on those landscapes. And Stuart Prim, who's a Duke ecologist, recently did a study that found that even where you are losing species, which is happening all around the world, the rate of loss is lower in parks and wilderness and other protected reserves. So even if you do lose some species, these areas that are protected areas do a better job of slowing that species loss. Another study done by the University of Michigan, I believe it was University of Michigan, found that strictly protected areas such as national parks and biological reserves have been more effective at reducing deforestation in the Amazon rainforest than protected zones that allow for controlled removal of trees and other natural resources. Again, the more what they call sustainable use areas. Strictly protected areas, state and national biological stations, biological reserves, and national state parks consistently avoided more deforestation than sustainable use areas. That doesn't mean that those places didn't have some illegal logging. They did, but they are lower there. The rate of loss is lower in those protected areas. Another research that was recently done from researchers from Australia, South Africa, and the UK examined the results of studies of 80 protected areas from the past 30 years to determine their effect on biodiversity. And their conclusion was, our work has now shown that protected areas have significant biodiversity benefits. In general, plants and animal populations are larger, and more species are found inside rather than outside of protected areas. In other words, they're doing their job, the job that we hope that they will do, and they do it more effectively. And even that's been shown now in marine reserves, which we don't have nearly as many of as terrestrial parks, but they're becoming more popular. And this was California has a bunch, 29 I think it is, marine reserves along its coast where there's no commercial fishing allowed. And what they found is that the populations and sizes of key species of fish, along with starfish, urchins, crabs, and so forth, increase more in the protected areas than in the unprotected oceans nearby. So we have the same results for terrestrial landscapes as well as marine landscapes. And the research suggests that this whole idea that protected areas don't work is not correct assumption. And also, human well-being is already a core of conservation policy, because I can argue here that things like protected wilderness areas and parks and so forth already protect water and so forth. Like, I'll give you an example. I used to live in Livingston there by north of Yellowstone Park. And most of you may know that the Yellowstone River is considered a blue ribbon trout stream through Paradise Valley coming out of Yellowstone. Well, in the summertime, in a drought year, none of the tributaries to the Yellowstone River have water in them because they all get dewatered for irrigation, for hay production. And the only reason the Yellowstone River is a blue ribbon trout stream is because it comes out of Yellowstone Park with a big head of water. So the same volume of water that comes out of the park at Gardner is what goes by Livingston 60 miles upstream. And if it wasn't for the protected area of the park, that Yellowstone River would not be a blue ribbon trout stream. So that's an example of how the protected areas are still already helping out with the idea of human values. Then this whole, I think, straw man thing about nature's purity and fragility. No one who has spent any time in wild places or knows history is naive to suggest that wild places, are totally untouched or pristine by the footprints of humans. But there's, as I said, a vast difference between something like Manhattan or LA and the Arctic Wildlife Refuge in terms of human influence. And those arguments are done to try to undercut or undermine the idea that there are such places that are largely self-willed. The other thing is there's little evidence that human-centered management achieves better results. So if you compare Forest Service managed land that are multiple use lands or BLM multiple use lands, they have a whole lot more problems on them than places like Yellowstone Park or Glacier Park. Not that those places don't have problems, but in terms of how the conservation values are protected, the parks and wilderness areas work better. Another critique is that parks and wilderness are American cultural imperialism. And this one really bugs me, because it's sort of like, for example, democracy came from Greece. And most of us think that democratic processes are a good thing, even though the Greeks thought of it. So does that mean that we should call it cultural imperialism because democracy is spreading around the world, or that we honor all the cultural values in other places that most of us would find not acceptable? For example, stoning women for adultery or other things that are done in certain parts of the world. And I did a bunch of research because I knew that this was what we call wilderness, and the way we think about wilderness and parks is, in our culture, a way of showing respect for the landscape and an ethical consideration, and that these are sacred lands. That's the way we think about it, really. And those, all sorts of cultures had sacred lands, whether, it's Native American cultures here in the United States, like Black Hills were sacred to the Sioux, the Crazy Mountains over by Livingston was sacred to the Crow Indians. And you go around the world, there are so many sacred sites in different cultures. Like in Japan, a lot of their higher mountains are considered sacred areas. In India, there was ancient sacred forests where Siddhartha supposedly sat for 7 years thinking about how to get to enlightenment. The Chinese sacred mountains, this is pretty cool looking mountains. But anyway, these are regarded, a lot of Chinese mountains are considered sacred places. In the Iran, there's the, again, areas that characterized by nature worship and the followed injunctions regarding protection of the earth is a common cultural theme in all sorts of cultures around the world. Aboriginals had sacred geography in parts of Australia. In the Hawaiian Islands, the Hawaiians thought about some of the volcanoes as sacred lands. And same with, even Northern Europeans have sacred sites. Years ago, I was in Germany, which my ancestors come from, and I was kind of shocked. There's stone hedges and so forth, sort of like Indian ruins in the United States there in Germany. And I thought, my ancestors had their sacred sites too, and they were places that are still protected in those countries as places that we cherish and protect because they're areas where we see as where nature deserves to be treated differently. So this has been a theme in cultures all around the world. And what we call it something different. We call it parks or we call it wilderness. It's following on the footsteps of the same cultural ideas. And this is a quote from Aldo Leopold. A flourishing culture requires revamping nature, but when do we go too far? And we're remodeling the Alhambra with a steam shovel, and we're proud of our yardage. We shall hardly relinquish the shovel, which after all has many good points. But we are in need of a gentler, more objective criteria for successful use. And I think that what parks and wilderness does, partly, is it gets us to think about landscapes and our effects on it. We understand we have a place to compare, which I'll talk about in a minute. But when we don't have anything that we set aside as being different from the rest of the way we exploit the world, we don't even know what effect we're having. Anyway, the Bikini Atoll is used by a lot of those who are against protecting land, saying that there's, nature isn't fragile. But I came up with this study and found out that, well, despite what it said, there are 42 species that are missing compared to before the nuclear blast, and 28 are locally extinct. And when you think about that, this area is mostly still pristine around that. So there's a lot of species that can colonize that atoll, the atoll. That shows you that there is impacts from what we're doing. And again, another Aldo Leopold quote: every cog and wheel is the first precaution, to keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. And I have this all the time. I took lots and lots of ecology courses between undergraduate and graduate school. And the message I took away from it is how little we understand how things work. And I still love reading studies and so forth, but the thing that I come away with is that we don't understand very well how all these things are interconnected. And so the last word in ignorance is the man who says of an animal or plant, what good is it? Man, do you hear that once in a while? What good are mosquitoes, or what good are, the bees or ants on the ground? Well, I always assume that if something exists out there, it probably has some purpose and use that's worth protecting. And it goes on to say, only a fool would discard seemingly useless parts. To keep every cog and wheel is the first caution of intelligent tinkering. And what we're doing when we don't protect areas is that we are tinkering and throwing away parts. And so there's this whole idea that we need to have guardians, not gardeners. And that's Emma Maris's book, Rambunctious Garden, is an advocate that we know enough about how the world works that we can garden it and decide what plants we want or what animals we want where, and the heck with the rest of it. And, there's a place for gardens, but there's also a place for protecting areas. So this is the part of the talk that maybe a lot of you are more familiar with. But anyway, what is wilderness? You got designated big wilderness, legally protected federal lands Congress has specifically set aside from most commercial exploitation. And it can be over all sorts of federal lands. It can be Fish and Wildlife Service lands, national parks, BLM lands, and so forth. And one of the things about the Wilderness Act is it requires that designated lands be untrammeled. And untrammeled doesn't mean it's pristine. It means that the landscape is largely operating under natural conditions, and human impacts are minimized on purpose, and the land is largely self-willed. And so we got all these things that most of you are probably aware of, I guess. I found out, but you know, backpacking, horse packing, hunting, fishing, rafting, skiing, those kinds of activities, and even tree hugging is allowed in wilderness areas. And we have many people to thank for the creation of wilderness areas in our country, but Bob Marshall was one of the advocates, which the Bob Marshall Wilderness named for. Bob Marshall worked for the Forest Service here in Missoula, among other places, northern Idaho, did a lot of hiking around this area, and he was one of the founders of the Wilderness Society. And when the Wilderness Society was founded, this is a quote that seems to have gotten forgotten by the Wilderness Society these days, but Bob Marshall said, "We want no stragglers, for in the past, far too much good wilderness has been lost by those whose first instinct is to compromise." And in many ways, that echoes another well-known conservationist, David Brower, who suggested that compromise always happens in any of these political discussions, but that the compromise should be done by those who are not the advocates rather than people that are advocating for wilderness and parks. So what David Brower would say is that those who want to protect areas should be advocates for protection, not assume that you have to make all these compromises up front. And I can tell you some conservation history stories. I'll tell you a couple, and they're kind of interesting. Like when the California Desert Wilderness Bill was passed in 1994, I have some friends that were real active in that proposal. And there was over 8 million acres designated as wilderness then. And when they did their proposal, they expected that, okay, we're going to list all these areas we'd love to have as wilderness, but we're going to lose some of them. You know, when the legislation and the politics comes by, we're going to lose them. And they also proposed that the Mojave National Park be created, which didn't get created. They changed it to Mojave National Preserve. But in the debate over creating the National Preserve, whether it should be a park or preserve, all these wilderness areas just sailed right on through in the legislation, and nobody said anything. So almost everything that they proposed as wilderness wound up getting legislatively passed by Congress. And the point being that if they had started out saying, oh, well, this probably won't go and this one won't go, they wouldn't have gotten nearly as many acres protected as wilderness. So now we have 704 wilderness areas in 44 states. And one of the real benefits, and I think this is something that people forget, that of wilderness and parks is protection of beauty. And beauty is an important attribute. I mean, it's the kind of thing that fills our souls and motivates us. And one of the things that we get out of wilderness is protection of that criteria. But we also have things, the ecological services like clean water, critical habitat for wildlife, natural processes like wildfire or floods or any of those kind of things that shape ecosystems. Spiritual contemplation is really important for a lot of people and why they like to go to these areas. And it's really important habitat for forest elves. And forest elves they need wild places. They can't exist without them. And so we have those. And I'm kind of getting into one of the things that I know a lot about Yellowstone Park. I've spent lots and lots of time in Yellowstone, and I've tried to get every single book and magazine article I've ever been written about Yellowstone and read them. And one of the things that about Yellowstone is that it was really, Yellowstone is attacked, by the way. They call it the Yellowstone Model. And it's attacked by the Anthropocene boosters, or whatever you want to call them, as this cultural imperialism. And they say the Yellowstone Model has been spread around the world as if it's a bad thing. And I think the Yellowstone Model is a great thing. And the Yellowstone Model is interesting because it was created right after the Civil War, when after the Civil War, we were, particularly Americans, were putting this whole westward movement of manifest destiny and the settling of the West. Mining was a big thing, and this is like in Montana here, for example, the first gold mining occurred towards the end of the Civil War in the 1860s. And so mining camps were being developed in Montana. Shortly after that, herds of cattle were being moved into Montana and so forth. So Yellowstone was the antithesis of this. It was setting aside this landscape, saying, this is a place we're not going to have all this manifest destiny going on in development. And that idea has spread around the world, so now there's at least 1,842, I don't know if that's the most current figure, it's the one I could find. More than 100 countries have national parks. And Yellowstone was the first one, but there were all sorts of other ones that followed rapidly after. Australia had Royal National Park 7 years later. Canada created Banff National Park in 1885. And Canada had the first Park Service. But this idea has spread throughout the world. And the reason is because it's a model that works, as I've said earlier. It is a thing that protects biodiversity. It creates all those opportunities for spiritual renewal, for protection of beauty, and so forth. And here are some pictures of some of the early advocates in the American conservation movement. John Muir with Teddy Roosevelt, Bob Marshall in the center, and then Aldo Leopold and Olaf Muri were other early advocates of wilderness and parks back in the 1930s. And one of the things that I think that wilderness and parks represent is self-restraint. I see it as a very good human trait that says these are places where, you know, we're not going to try to occupy the whole earth and take over the whole earth. And we are going to say that there are places where other living creatures and the landscapes that they live in are allowed to be self-sustaining. And this is a quote from Terry Tempest Williams. Some of you may know her. She's written a number of books, Refuge and some others. She's a wonderful person, really friendly. Anyway, the eyes of the future are looking back at us, and they are praying for us to see beyond our own time. They are kneeling with hands clasped that we might act with restraint, that we might leave room for life that is destined to come. To protect what is wild is to protect what is gentle. Perhaps the wildness we fear is the pause between our own heartbeats, the silent space that says we live only by grace. Wilderness lives by this same grace. Wild mercy is in our hands. And I think that's a very important aspect of what wilderness and parks represent. And so just to mention a few proposals in this region, there's the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act, which would, if enacted, would protect most of the roadless areas in Idaho, Montana, and northern northwest Wyoming. This, if it were to be enacted, would, I guarantee you, would work very well towards protecting most of the native species in our region from extinction. An even bigger idea from that same basis is the Yellowstone Yukon proposal, which would protect lands all the way from in the Yukon all the way down into Yellowstone Park. And this represents the areas that are already in that protected zone. And the idea is to connect these protected areas with other protected areas so that animals can move through corridors and you have large enough areas to sustain those species. And another quote, wilderness is loyalty to the earth. The love of wilderness is more than a hunger for what is always beyond reach. It is also an expression of loyalty to the earth which bore us and sustained us, and the only home we shall ever know, the only paradise we ever need, if only we had eyes to see. So another quote from Wallace Stegner, another well-known writer, called The Geography Home. We simply need the wild country available to us, even if we never do more than drive to the edge, look in, for it is a means of reassuring ourselves of our sanity as creatures, a part of the geography of hope. And that's what wilderness and parks symbolize more than anything for me. When we do things like establish parks and wilderness, it's showing the best things, as far as I'm concerned, of people. It's one of the important ethical considerations. It is not a bad thing, and that's what's so disturbing about the whole critique from the Anthropocene boosters and so forth, is they try to characterize this as some sort of mean-spirited attempt to keep people in poverty, when in fact I think that it is important for all of us to have these places. So I'm going to end it right there, and then open it up for questions. So, thank you. Yes.
Thank you. It's such a terror for me because, you know, my experience sometimes of Yellowstone is that it feels like a zoo. You know, it feels like we're driving through and we're observing others, and we're not participating in any other way than gawking, you know, and I also do think of the people who were removed from that land to create the park.
Well, see, that's one of the myths.
Yeah, let me continue. So in that sense, I do see it as part of Manifest Destiny, that it's a piece, that creating the parks is part of that, in the sense that there's a mindset, and I've had it myself, you know, I've been schooled in it myself and known it myself, that human beings, we wreck a place and we don't belong, and I think it comes from a place of not belonging, and I know you understand that. And so my concern with Amazon is not that we create spaces that are multi-use, but that we do protect people who are still intact. And it's one of the only places in the world where there are actually people who haven't been touched by this. And my wish, my ultimate wish, is that they not be, you know, that they be free to live indigenously. And it's a longing that I think I share, you know, to go there and to know that kind of intimacy and trust that my food source, you know, just trust, and to know a place like my backbone, or to know a place like my breath, in the sense that I know how to live. I'm, you know, it's beyond survival, it's enjoyment and freedom. And so that's where I'm missing with the parks. It's like, it's what I want to see there, and it's what I definitely want for other animals that live there. But I'd also love to see some human experience of that in these places, you know, so that that indigenous soul is allowed, you know, to exist and thrive.
Well, I'm not an expert on the Amazon, so I can't address you entirely, but I know there are indigenous reserves there. But they also have the sustainable development areas, which they just don't work because population grows, the technology increases, you know, there's a difference between hunting with spears and hunting with rifles, for example. And that is where the self-restraint has to be implemented, because in the end you don't get anything that survives, not even the indigenous cultures, if there's not some sort of self-restraint on what is occurring there. And I'm glad you made the point, and I'm going to emphasize it, because one of the critiques that, actually I didn't go into it, it comes further along here, I decided to stop it earlier, but with Yellowstone, getting back to that, setting it aside in the face of Manifest Destiny, some of the proponents of the Anthropocene say that Yellowstone was created by excluding the Native Americans that were there. But that shows that they don't understand and they haven't read the history, because all the tribes that had any association with Yellowstone were put on reservations as part of the Manifest Destiny so that we could mine, log, and all that stuff before anybody talked about making a park there. And that is the same with, you know, it was part of the reason indigenous people were removed wasn't so we could have parks. That's my point. The people were removed so that we could have development. So in a sense, a place like Yellowstone was a counter influence to that whole development mindset that was basically our American political policy at the time. And
well, and it could be that part of the growth from preserving the park could be the reentry and the allowing of people who are there to in an indigenous mind. You know, and I don't know what's happening. It's happened with Glacier as well. I don't know. It was hunting ground, and as far as I know, the people aren't allowed to hunt there.
no, they're not. And I would argue it's a good thing.
But to say that this is our property, I mean, to say that Yellowstone is my property, or to say that Glacier is my property, and that these people can't be there, it is for me the continuation of that destiny. And the way to resolve that is to heal that wound with those people who were raped and murdered and, yes, put on reservations for all of us to be here. That pain is so raw and deep and real. And it's real with bison. It's real with what we do with bison as soon as they exit the park.
Right.
You know, it's so painful.
Well, I agree with you to a point, except that I would say that things like parks and wilderness aren't just for us. This is for the whole world. This is for future generations. It's for everyone. And it doesn't belong to anyone per se. And in that sense, I don't think that anybody has a certain claim to those places. These are things that are bigger than all human culture, is what I'm trying to say, and that they are places that we, given the world's population, given the technology, given all the things that have happened in human culture, they're simply not going to survive unless we do this kind of premeditated protection of these areas. And that's what's been shown around the world in places where they've tried to, for example, have indigenous cultures that have any kind of contact with the larger, world. The technology, just even something like taking American Indians as an example, the introduction of rifles made a big difference in hunting efficiency. And, can you take back that culture? It'd be hard to do that. And, if you spent all day long, did you ever read the book Ishi about the last last Indian in California? And he hid out for like 40 years and then he was discovered. Anyway, Ishi would spend an hour making one arrowhead, an arrow. And if you think about it, if you spend an hour making an arrow, every arrow, you're not going to waste shots, just randomly shooting things. But as soon as it's easy to buy bullets or a rifle and so forth, then you can do a lot more damage in a short period of time, which is why we have hunting seasons and, limitations on what people are allowed to do. All that is an example of self-restraint that is required. It's in the days when everybody rode horses, we didn't need speed limits. Well, when you got cars, now you have to have limits put in place. Otherwise, you have mayhem and chaos and a lot of problems. And I don't know how any way to reverse that at this point in time. But if you're going to be able to reverse it, having parks and wilderness are going to be the best place you could do that in the future. Does that ever happen?
I'm in full agreement with protection. Like I said, it's tough. I'm trying to figure out how to heal the wounds with the people and the wounds on the land, and it's so much. It's so I'm in full agreement that we've got to have more. We need more that is off off limits to the heavy hand of extraction. We absolutely have to. We've got to cut the extraction.
You know, I mean, this all ties into all sorts of other things, but you know, I mean, ultimately, you got to talk about reducing, you know, global population, because that's the thing that is a threat to all these places ultimately, and as we, you know, even if people use less resources per capita, the more people you have, it just totally negates any, you know, advantages you might get from whether it's an increased efficiency of something like energy use or anything else. It all gets negated eventually by population.
Well, I'd like to think that the planet's going to figure that out for us, because I don't want to be the one to decide who's going to go.
Well, it may happen that way, yeah. So, but we might take a lot of things down with us. So, that's the, yeah. Other questions or comments? Yes.
You just mentioned that you worked on the Northwoods National Park.
The what?
The Northwoods
Yeah.
National Park. I was a ranger up in Baxter. Do you have any comments on Roxanne Quimby's efforts to form a national park?
Okay, I will answer that, sure. To give you background, Roxanne Quimby used to own Burt's Bees. She sold her company and used the money to buy up land in Maine with the idea of trying to donate the land for a park, which is, she said she worked in Baxter State Park. Percival Baxter did exactly the same thing. He was a wealthy Mainer. He bought up the land around Mount Katahdin, which is the highest peak in Maine, and donated it to the state of Maine, which, by the way, the state of Maine didn't want it at first. Refused to accept his gift until he also then endowed it for management and paying for all the things. Then finally, reluctantly, Maine accepted it. And now, of course, they're glad they have it, which is the common story you have all the time with these places. But so Roxanne Quimby is proposing to give away a bunch of land to people of the United States for a national park. And quite a number of people in Maine are opposed to the idea of having a national park created there. And gradually they've sort of broken down some of the resistance, because in part the timber industry in Maine has totally tanked, and so the economic opportunities in that part of Maine are greatly reduced. And so some people, of course, national parks do create some economic benefits to local populations, so that's one of the ways it's being sold. And our proposal at Restore is for a 3.2 million acre national park to be created primarily by buying private lands, private timber lands. Maine is, I mean, there's some astounding statistics about Maine, but like 90% of Maine is owned by 19 corporations and individuals. You know, 90% of the land area. So it's a very concentrated ownership of property, and a lot of this property has been sold. Over 7 million acres has changed hands in the last 10 or 15 years. So it's up for sale. Our proposal is that the federal government buy up the land, which is how national forests were created back east. That's how places like Great Smoky National Park, Acadia National Park were all acquired by buying up private land. And so the proposal we would have would keep Baxter State Park in the center and be surrounded by more parklands, essentially, around it. My feeling is that Roxanne Quimby is going to succeed eventually in getting the federal government to accept her donation of land. Once that happens, people will see in northern Maine that the sky has not fallen, and I think gradually it will be possible to add on to that original gift and expand. Whether we'll ever get to 3 million acres or whatever, be hard to say. But some of the land that's been sold in the last 10 to 15 years have been million-acre chunks. Plum Creek sold 1 million acres not too long ago in Maine. So all you had to do is have one person with the, or in the case of we're talking about the federal government, have enough money to acquire that land when it comes up for sale, and you can have a pretty big national park pretty quick. So that's the idea. Yes?
Thanks for sharing. So I have two questions. So one is that, so you mentioned that some conservationists believe that the nature is resilient, not fragile. So I would like to hear your own opinion on
Well, you know, it's one of those nuanced responses I would give you. Nature, if the effects on nature are things that have naturally occurred in the past, like forest fires or volcanic eruptions, there is quite a bit of resilience. That's because nature has had to deal with these things over and over and over again for millions of years. And so there are plants and animals that are adapted to these disruptions and disturbances, and they recover relatively well. On the other hand, a lot of the things that we are introducing as humans into the environment, whether it's toxins, whether it's global warming effects, whether it's just the wholesale destruction of habitat and fragmenting the habitat, those are things that nature is not as well adapted to. So the ability of a species to cope with those insults, you might say, is more limited. And as I talked about the fish in the West, you know, 4/5 of the native fish in the West, the American West, are endangered or on the endangered species list because of dams, water withdrawals, pollution, whatever, you know, introduction of other exotic animals, disease, all those things. So if you look at something like the species that are endangered around the world, we're losing a lot of species. A lot of them we don't even know what we're losing because they haven't been inventoried. And that, from the best estimates, has accelerated greatly in the last 100 years. So I would say in that sense, you know, nature isn't as resilient as some of these people would have us believe. At the same time, again, if it's something that has existed for many, many thousands of years, then it's something that natural systems are able to cope with. So.
You also mentioned there is a proposal from Yellowstone to
Yukon, yes.
So, so this program includes larger area. So does it mean that the conservation on the larger scale is more efficient?
Yes. Yeah. Her question is larger scale proposals more efficient in terms of protecting species? I presume that's your question. And that's what the evidence shows. You know, there's been known for a long time, biogeography, that small islands have fewer species and they go extinct much more regularly than larger islands. And that's where these theories were first developed. And in a sense, these parks and so forth are like islands. And so the larger the island, the less species extinctions we have, and the more resilient the nature is to any kind of losses. In other words, if you have 10,000 of an animal and you lose 10%, you still have, you know, 9,000 left. But if you have only 100 of it and you lose 10%, then it's much more likely that the other 90 that are left can just wink out because their numbers are too small to recover in time. And that's the idea behind having large protected areas. So, yes?
My question is kind of a two-part question. So it took a while for the creation of national parks to kind of emerge from the scenic values notion.
Yes.
And so now you have the Everglades and marshes and grasslands protected, which are much higher in biodiversity value. And so we kind of have arbitrary political sky islands in these parks. Mm-hmm. So they're separated from a lot of the ecological interactions. So I'm curious, so the first part is how you think the long-term kind of integration and functioning will endure with that separation. And then also the new conservationists, they couch a lot of their rhetoric in economic language. Mm-hmm. And so there's a big movement with ecosystem valuation or service valuation.
Right.
Do you think that's something, because it seems like largely it's hard to make any kind of, or gain any traction without couching your words in economic language. Is that something that this kind of Ed Abbey, Dave Foreman, your movement will want to try to do? Because a lot of firms are doing that now, trying to, but it's also based on human needs.
let me answer that one first, and then I'll come back to the other one. But basically, what he's asking, tell me if I've got your interpreted correctly, is whether putting economic value on places like parks and wilderness and so forth is a good idea. And whether that, and that's becoming a common way to justify creation of parks and wilderness and so forth. My answer to that is I can do a really good job of that. I mean, I've written articles about the economic values associated with protecting areas and so forth. But I would not want that to be the only criteria. Even though I can come up with economic valuation for these protected areas, ultimately, you could lose them based on economics as well. For example, it wasn't, some of you may have been here in the, I think it was in the 80s or 90s, there was talks about putting oil wells in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. And, you know, you're not going to be able to make an economic argument that the Bob Marshall Wilderness is worth more than oil. And that's going to be hard anyway to make that economic valuation. That's why I think you have to justify these things on more ethical rationales, just like we make argument that we shouldn't have people enslaved based on ethics. Not, you know, you can make an economic argument that maybe we ought to have slavery, you know, and if you leave it up to economics, I think ultimately you might lose. But at the same time, because of a lot of the people that are opposed to parks and wilderness use economics as their rationale for not protecting areas, if I can come up with an economic justification for why development doesn't make sense, I'll use that argument, because I don't have to then try to convince them of the ethical justifications for protecting landscapes. And in a lot of cases, you can win on economics. In a lot of cases, because a lot of particularly resource development, and I'll use the examples right around here, logging trees at 10,000 feet near Yellowstone Park doesn't make economic sense, because the trees grow slowly, the cost of logging and the development, plus if you do any kind of accounting of the negative effects on the landscape, spread of weeds, soil compaction, anything else, sedimentation in streams, I could show you easily that economically that makes no sense to log there. So if I can do that, and that'll win the argument, I'm willing to do it. But ultimately, that isn't the reason. I mean, economics isn't the reason I want to protect areas. So the first part of your question was?
Yeah, it was just about the longevity of the parks based on biodiversity.
Yeah. The longevity is something that is really worrisome, particularly because in global climate change, a lot of the places that we've set aside, there's going to be shifts in habitat, in species, and a lot of disruption that's going to happen. So the idea that we might have set aside some place to, I'll just make up something, to protect a particular fish or an animal, is the case with a lot of our wildlife refuges and so forth. Their value may change, like the Everglades you mentioned. You know, that's likely to get flooded out with global warming in 100 years. There's a place, if you've ever been to the Everglades, there's a place called Red Rock Pass, and it's 5 feet above sea level. Well, they're saying sea level is going to rise 6 feet, so that part of the Everglades is going to be underwater probably in 100 years. And so the idea that that will ultimately protect whatever it was originally set aside for is probably not going to hold up. On the other hand, that argues, in my view, for having larger protected areas with connections, so that if species are forced to move, and some will move and some won't be able to move, but at least some will be able to move and find habitat that's still suitable in an adjacent area. And that's the best hope under that scenario. But yeah, we'll probably still find a lot of things that will not make that shift very well, and they won't survive the changes long term. Other questions? Yes?
There are some folks in Helena, some politicians that are advocating the transfer of federal public lands, BLM, Forest Service lands to
Yes.
the state. Do you care to comment on that concept?
I would hate to see it happen. I think that the reason there's this emphasis in trying to, and it's not just happening in Helena, it's in Utah, Wyoming, there's bills, Idaho, all these western states are pushing the same concept. And the reason I think is because the people that are anxious to exploit lands realizes that the state is more easily influenced politically, as well as not having the funds to adequately manage those lands as well as the federal government can. And so if you're somebody who wants to access those resources that are on those lands, it'll be easier, I think, under state than under federal management. The federal laws give us better protection, even though on one hand, I will argue that a lot of the management under the BLM or the Forest Service is still politically manipulated and could be a lot better. I'd rather take my chances with the federal government than with the state government when it comes to that myself. And that's my experience. The example I might give with state lands in a lot of places in the West, some of you may know this, but not everybody, a lot of state lands are mandated for production, resource production, to provide funding for school systems. And so they have, at least some people interpret that means they have to allow logging or grazing or whatever. Now, a lot of, again, using your thing about the economics, I think I could make a pretty good argument that the states lose in that sort of single-minded development things because of the economic consequences of that development. I'll give you an example. In Oregon, a lot of the logging on state lands is contributing to the demise of the salmon industry. So on one hand, you have salmon fishermen that are losing their jobs because the logging on the state lands, allowing sedimentation in streams and the effects on the salmon fisheries, loss of wood that would normally be in the stream and so forth. That's never part of the accounting. If there was a full economic accounting, it would probably make no sense for the limited amount of money that's contributed. Grazing is even more that way biased in states like, I don't know what it is in Montana, but I believe in Oregon they only get like $600,000 or $700,000 a year from grazing fees on the state lands. And for the damage that's done, even if there's just a spread of weeds or one other thing, or cheatgrass invasion, we have to suffer those consequences and put up with trying to mitigate those things. And so the ranchers get to graze at a relatively low cost, and society as a whole has to put up with the consequences. And so that's more prevalent on state lands than it is on federal lands, even though you have same issues on federal lands too. So, other comments?